The first time Don Matteo Vercelli saw her, she wasn't stealing from him. Not exactly. She was crouched behind the pantry door, cheeks hollow from hunger, hands trembling as she tried to stuff the last piece of bread into her apron. He had been walking the halls of his family estate, sharp leather shoes echoing on marble floors, expecting the usual quiet obedience from his staff. But instead he froze at the sight of her, a small, thin girl, no more than 20, with eyes like storm clouds and a courage that made him uncomfortable. "Put that back," he said, voice low and dangerous, yet strange and soft, almost like he didn't want to scare her. The word hung in the air between them, the faint scent of the stolen bread mixed with her fear, and something inside him clenched. Not anger, not exactly. She looked up, eyes wide, lips trembling. For a second, she didn't speak, and in that silence, he realized he could hear everything: the ragged sound of her breathing, the faint scraping of her shoes on the stone floor, the tiny heartbeat of fear that matched the rhythm of the storm outside. She swallowed hard. "I was hungry," she whispered, voice cracking under shame. Matteo didn't respond. He simply watched. Years of controlling every corner of his life, every deal, every enemy, every heartbeat in his world, had taught him one thing: fear was always followed by action. But this girl, this fragile human with her crooked shoulders and frantic hands, made him hesitate. For the first time in his life, power didn't feel like power. It felt hollow. "I said, put it back," he repeated, this time more sharply. She obeyed, slowly, but not without a tiny defiance in the way she avoided meeting his eyes directly. That defiance, paired with the fear, lit something inside him he didn't understand. Not yet. She fled before he could speak again, leaving the bread behind and a trail of stolen hope in her wake. Matteo stood frozen in the pantry, smelling the lingering scent of wheat and fear, knowing the girl would haunt him. He didn't know why. She was just a maid, nothing more. And yet, the next morning, reports came in. "The girl has returned," his housekeeper said nervously. "She's asking for work again." Matteo's eyes narrowed. She hadn't learned, had she? Hadn't feared him enough? Or was this madness? He watched her as she cleaned, scrubbed, and moved around the house with quiet efficiency. She was almost invisible, but that storm in her eyes never dulled. It fascinated him. Every small act of defiance, a glance, a misplaced dish, a word left unspoken felt like a personal challenge. Weeks passed, and Matteo's patience wore thin. Not with her work, which was impeccable, but with the way his mind kept returning to the moment she stole that bread. The audacity, the desperation, the hunger. Every time he caught sight of her, some inexplicable tension curled in his chest, a mixture of irritation and something else. And then one evening it happened. The night was wet, storm clouds rolling across the city skyline, lightning illuminating the Vercelli mansion in jagged flashes. Matteo was walking to his private office when he saw her sneaking into the kitchen again. This time it wasn't bread, it was a small roast, barely enough for one. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He followed, step by silent step, through corridors lit only by flickering candlelight. The air smelled of rain, damp stone, and secrecy. And then, at the edge of the main courtyard, he saw her. Not alone. A small child sat on the steps, wide-eyed, clutching the piece of meat in her tiny hands. Her hair was tangled, face streaked with dirt, but her eyes the same stormy gray. Looked up at Matteo, fearless and trusting in a way that made his chest tighten. The girl, the maid, kneeled beside the child, whispering reassurances he couldn't hear. The child giggled softly, leaning against her shoulder, and in that moment, Matteo realized something he had never allowed himself to consider. This was more than theft. This was survival. And something else, something he couldn't name yet, was binding him to her. For the first time in his life, Matteo Vercelli froze. Not with fear, not with anger, but with an unexpected, overwhelming awareness that his world, the cold, calculated life he had built, was colliding with something messy, human, and impossibly real. The storm raged on, lightning splitting the sky, thunder rolling across the distant city. Matteo's mind raced. What would he do now? Would he demand her leave? Punish her? Or something else? Something softer, something dangerous for a man like him. He took a step forward, then stopped. And in that frozen moment, the girl looked up at him, straight into his eyes, unafraid. The child followed her gaze, innocent and trusting. Matteo knew he couldn't turn away. Not now, not ever. But he also knew this. Everything he had built, every rule, every deal, every life he had controlled, was about to be challenged by the one thing he had never ruled, love. The night held its breath. The rain soaked the stone steps, and Matteo Vercelli, the unyielding Mafia boss, realized that following her had brought him not to punishment, but to a reckoning he hadn't known he needed. And for the first time, he wondered if he could survive it. Matteo stayed frozen on the wet stone steps, rain dripping from his shoulders, watching the small family before him. The girl, her hair plastered to her forehead, held the child closer. Her arms were small, but the way she cradled him made it clear she would take a bullet for him without hesitation. Matteo's chest tightened at the sight, and a cold, unfamiliar pain started to coil inside him. He didn't know why it hurt so much to see someone else care, someone else possess a love he had never allowed himself. He took another step forward, boots splashing in the puddles, but the girl flinched slightly. Not out of fear, he knew she wasn't afraid, but instinct. He stopped, realizing that intimidation had no place here. This was different. This was human, fragile, and raw. She straightened, and in that moment, their eyes met again. The storm outside mirrored the tension inside his chest, chaotic, powerful, unpredictable. "You shouldn't be out here," he said finally, voice low, controlled. Not a command, not a threat, just a statement. The girl didn't back away. Instead, she held the child tighter, and her voice, though soft, carried a strength that surprised him. "He's hungry," she said. "I can't let him go without food." Matteo's hands clenched at his sides. He wanted to tell her to leave, to obey the rules, to accept the order and walk away. But he couldn't. Something in her unwavering gaze made every piece of his carefully constructed world, the empire, the power, the control, feel meaningless. "How long have you been here?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. But it came out softer than he intended. "Since he was born," she replied simply, glancing at the child. 3 years. 3 years. Matteo felt his pulse hit his throat. He had known the girl for months, but he had never noticed, never asked. And in that instant, he realized he had been blind not just to her, but to life itself. The child looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. Matteo swallowed hard. The boy reminded him of something he had lost long ago: innocence, hope, and the simple, devastating truth that love didn't obey rules. It existed outside of power, wealth, and fear. "Why didn't you tell me?" Matteo asked, voice barely audible over the storm. The girl shook her head. "Because you don't care about people like us." Her eyes flashed with pain and defiance. "You only care about yourself and your empire." He flinched at her words. She had him figured out. She knew his reputation, the life he led, the cold heart he wore like armor. And yet, somehow, she was unafraid. That combination, strength and vulnerability, defiance and survival, was like nothing he had ever encountered. Matteo turned away for a moment, unable to bear the heat of her gaze. He needed air, clarity, distance. But as he did, he realized he had nowhere to go. The mansion, the streets, his life, it all felt suddenly irrelevant compared to the small warmth of the child in her arms. "I can help," he said finally. The words felt strange on his tongue, almost foreign. "I can provide. Food, safety, whatever you need." The girl's eyes narrowed, suspicion sharpening her features. "Why?" she asked. "Why would a man like you care?" He hesitated. The truth was complicated. He didn't care, not in the way she thought. But he couldn't ignore them, couldn't stop thinking about the boy's wide eyes, the way she carried him, the quiet bravery she showed even in the face of fear. Something inside him stirred, something he had spent years burying beneath contracts, violence, and fear. "Because I can," he said finally, simple and blunt. "And because I don't know. I can't ignore it." The girl studied him, silence stretching between them, broken only by the rain and distant thunder. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then she lowered her gaze to the boy, brushing the wet hair from his face. "We don't need charity," she said quietly. "We need someone who will leave us alone." Matteo clenched his jaw. Leave them alone. That was the impossible truth. His life wasn't one that allowed leaving anyone alone, not her, not the boy, not himself. And yet, he realized that he didn't want to. Not entirely. The thought terrified him. "Then I'll leave you alone," he said carefully, "but on my terms." She glanced up, skepticism in her eyes. "Your terms?" "Yes," he said, stepping closer despite the puddles and rain. "I don't know what this is yet, but I will not harm you or him, and I will protect you. That's all I can promise for now." The girl hesitated. He could see the war inside her, fear, distrust, need, and a flicker of hope. Finally, she nodded once, almost imperceptibly. The child giggled softly, sensing something shifting between the two adults. Matteo felt a pang in his chest, a sudden recognition that his life, the empire, the power, the rules would never be the same. The storm outside matched the storm inside him. He realized that following her, tracking her, had brought him not to punishment or anger, but to something infinitely more complicated. Something dangerous, something like love. And yet, as he watched her cradle the child, he felt the first prickle of regret. He had missed 3 years. 3 years of not knowing. 3 years of not being part of their lives. The thought weighed heavy on him, a dark shadow over the small spark of connection forming between them. He stepped back, letting them retreat into the shadows of the mansion's stone corridors. But he knew, deep in the marrow of his bones, that he would not leave them alone, not really. Not ever. As the thunder rolled across the city, Matteo stood in the rain, boots sinking slightly into puddles, and realized the truth. Some mistakes could not be undone, some losses could not be reversed, and some hearts once stirred could never return to the cold they had known. And for the first time he wondered if he even wanted to go back. The next morning Matteo awoke in his vast bedroom, the heavy velvet curtains still dripping with rain from the storm. He stared at the ceiling, the grand chandeliers above casting fractured reflections across the darkened room. His mind refused the quiet he demanded, replaying the scene from the night before, the girl, the child, the way they had existed together in a world untouched by his power, his empire, his reputation. Even the whispered fear his name carried through the city felt meaningless compared to the image of her small hands holding that child close. He rose, dressing in black, tailored suits that once made him feel invincible but now felt like armor that had lost its purpose. Matteo had always known control, every deal, every life, every corner of his world bent to his will. But she defied control in the most impossible way, and he realized, with a jolt he didn't like admitting, that he had no idea how to approach her. The house was quiet, servants moved in their rehearsed patterns, the air heavy with wet wood and the faint scent of expensive cigars. But Matteo ignored it all. His boots carried him silently down the hallways, past empty corridors and flickering candlelight, until he arrived at the kitchen door. The door was ajar, and he paused, listening. He could hear soft laughter of the child. He stepped closer, heart tightening in a way he couldn't explain. The girl was there, kneeling as she had been the night before, preparing a small breakfast. The boy sat cross-legged, giggling as she offered him small bites, her fingers trembling slightly as she tried to hide it. When she noticed him, she froze, a single eyebrow raised in wary curiosity. "You're back," she said simply, as if noticing Matteo again was a casual observation rather than the moment that had consumed his night. Matteo started, unsure what to say. His usual control over words failed him. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." She studied him, eyes narrowing slightly. "We're all right. Don't need help." He exhaled sharply, that same defiance, the same stubborn insistence that had made him hesitate the night before, now pushed against him again. He realized she wasn't just protecting the child, she was protecting herself. And he, for all his power, had no right to break that wall she'd built. "Do you always defy me?" he asked, the words softer than he intended. She tilted her head, a small smirk playing on her lips. "I didn't think I had a choice." The honesty in her tone hit him harder than he expected. She wasn't playing a game, wasn't challenging him for sport, she was surviving. And the realization made Matteo feel the weight of every cruel decision he had made in his life. Every moment he had traded love for power, every opportunity for connection he had thrown away. The child looked up at him, smiling shyly, a small hand reaching out. Matteo froze again. He hadn't known that a 3-year-old could have such an impact, but something about that innocent gesture, that unguarded trust, cut through the layers of ice he had built around his heart. He wanted to recoil, wanted to tell himself to stay distant, but he didn't. He knelt slightly, keeping his distance, and allowed the child to place a small hand in his. The girl's eyes went wide, and for a heartbeat, Matteo thought she might flee. But she didn't. She simply watched, her stormy eyes assessing, calculating. She was cautious, as she should be. And he respected that. "I'm Matteo," he said to the child, voice low but steady. "Do you know that?" The boy giggled. "Yes, Matteo." His pronunciation was slightly off, but the enthusiasm was real. Matteo's chest tightened in a way that frightened him. He had never known this. Never felt a life this pure brush against him, without calculating gain, without strings attached. "You need food," Matteo said finally, turning to the girl. "Let me get you both something better than this." She shook her head quickly. "I said we don't need help. I don't need your charity." He hesitated. The words charity and help had never been foreign to him. But now they felt hollow. "I'm not offering charity," he said carefully. "I'm offering protection." Her lips pressed into a thin line. He could see the war waging in her mind. Fear, pride, anger, and need, every emotion tangled in a way that made him ache. "Why should I trust you?" she asked finally, voice low, barely audible over the rain that had slowed to a drizzle outside. Matteo looked down at the small hand still gripping his, at the way the child leaned into her shoulder for comfort, at the storm still lingering in her eyes. He realized, with painful clarity, that the answer wasn't something he could fabricate. He had no proof, no promise that could erase the years of fear, the walls she had built. "I don't expect you to," he said simply. "Not yet. But I won't hurt you. I won't hurt him. And I won't leave you alone, not in a way that puts you at risk. That's the truth." Silence stretched between them. The kitchen, the mansion, the rain-soaked world outside seemed to vanish, leaving only the three of them in a fragile bubble of tension. The girl's eyes softened slightly, though she still didn't smile. The child continued to hold Matteo's hand, oblivious to the danger, sensing only safety in the presence of someone larger, stronger, and, strangely, protective. Matteo straightened slowly, the first warmth of something dangerous and new seeping into his chest. The storm inside him was still raging, but now it carried a different weight, a hint of hope, a spark of connection he had never allowed himself to feel. For the first time in his life, Matteo Vercelli felt a desire to nurture rather than command, to protect rather than dominate, and it terrified him more than any enemy, more than any deal, more than any betrayal. He looked at the girl again, eyes locking in a silent understanding. He could follow rules, control empires, eliminate threats, but he could not control this. Not her, not the child, not the feelings stirring in him, impossible and unbidden, yet undeniable. And as the storm clouds parted over the city, a single ray of sunlight falling through the kitchen window, Matteo realized that the path ahead was uncertain, dangerous, but for the first time he wanted to walk it, not for power, not for fear, but for love he didn't yet fully understand. The girl's gaze remained guarded, the child's hand still in his, and Matteo felt the slow, inevitable pull of fate. But he knew one thing with brutal certainty: he would follow them, and he would not turn back. Days passed like heavy shadows over the mansion. Matteo moved through his empire with the same cold precision, but the memory of the girl and her child lingered in every corner of his mind, like smoke he couldn't dispel. He found himself checking corridors he had no reason to walk, pausing in empty rooms hoping for a glimpse of them. Every time he did, he felt the strange pull of unease mixed with fascination. The girl, whose name he finally learned was Isabella, never directly addressed him outside of necessity. Yet her presence, quiet, deliberate, unyielding, haunted him. He noticed the subtle ways she protected her child, the careful step she took through the house, always alert, always calculating risk. Matteo had never respected anyone the way he respected her. Not rivals, not allies, not even himself. One afternoon, Matteo found Isabella in the kitchen again, her hands moving deftly as she prepared the boy's lunch. She didn't look up when he entered, but he sensed her awareness, sharp and unrelenting. The child, seated at the wooden table, played with a small carved toy he had clearly made himself, laughing softly at the motions of some invisible friend. Matteo cleared his throat, attempting to mask the tension that always appeared when he saw them. "I assume you sleep well?" he asked, more as an observation than a question. Isabella glanced at him briefly, her gaze measured. "We sleep when we can," she replied. Her tone was firm, unwavering. "It's a luxury we don't often have." The word struck him harder than he expected. He had lived a life surrounded by luxury, power, and obedience, but he realized he had never truly understood what it meant to survive, to protect someone with nothing but grit and instinct. The realization made his chest ache. "I can provide," he said quietly. "Food, safety, shelter." She didn't flinch, didn't look impressed. She simply nodded once. "We don't ask for favors," she said almost softly, "and we don't accept them easily." He wanted to argue, to insist, but he knew she would not yield to force. Force had never moved her, and Matteo was starting to realize that power alone could not bridge the gap between them. This girl, this fragile, determined creature, challenged him in a way he had never known. As he turned to leave, he paused, noting the quiet strength in the way she straightened, the protective arc she formed around the child. He wanted to reach out, to offer reassurance, but he knew she would not accept it. And yet, he could not stop himself. That night, Matteo found himself walking the perimeter of the mansion, rain-slick streets reflecting the dim glow of city lights. The storm had passed, leaving a soft mist that clung to the air like a shroud. His mind was restless, turning over every detail of the past days, every interaction with Isabella and her child. He realized that he was no longer tracking her to punish her theft. He was following her because he couldn't not. It was then that he noticed movement in the shadows, figures emerging silently, almost like ghosts from the mist. Matteo tensed immediately, instincts kicking in. His empire had enemies always, and he could sense danger before it even arrived. But these figures weren't immediately threatening. They moved with precision, observing, calculating. One of them stepped forward, voice low and smooth. "Don Matteo, we know where she is, where the child is. They won't be safe if you don't act." Matteo's fists clenched. Safe from whom? The man didn't answer immediately. He simply handed Matteo a small envelope. Inside, a single photograph. Isabella and the child, outside the mansion, oblivious to the danger surrounding them. Matteo's chest tightened so violently it hurt to breathe. Someone had been watching them. Someone had taken note of the fragile life they led. His mind raced. He had spent years building walls around everything he cared about, shielding himself from vulnerability. And yet here, in the soft, human chaos of Isabella and her child, those walls were crumbling. He could feel the pull of responsibility, of guilt, of fear, all tangling with something that terrified him even more, an unfamiliar, growing affection. He stormed through the mansion, boots slamming against marble floors, heart hammering. When he reached the kitchen, Isabella looked up, startled, the child clutching at her skirts. "Matteo," she asked, sensing the storm in his presence. "We have company," he said sharply, his voice low, almost a growl. "And you're not safe here." Isabella froze, her eyes widening. What do you mean?" Matteo's jaw tightened. He reached out, placing a hand lightly on the boy's shoulder. The child looked up at him with trust that cut through every shadow in Matteo's chest. "Someone's been watching you," he said simply. "You and him. And they won't stop until they get what they want." Fear flickered in Isabella's eyes, but she squared her shoulders. "Then we leave," she said. "We have to, now." Matteo studied her, seeing both determination and desperation. The combination made him feel more alive than any deal, any fight, any power he had ever wielded. But it also terrified him, because he was beginning to understand that for the first time he could lose everything that mattered. Not his wealth, not his reputation, but them. The child tugged at Isabella's sleeve, and Matteo realized he would follow them anywhere, protect them, at any cost. And yet, deep inside, a shadow of doubt lingered. Could he really protect them? Could he navigate a world where even he wasn't invincible? He took a deep breath, looking at Isabella. "Then we leave," he said finally. "Together, but you have to trust me." Her eyes searched his, wary but desperate, and she nodded once. The child clutched Matteo's hand tightly, as if sealing an unspoken pact. Outside, the mist clung to the world like a ghostly veil. The night had grown silent again, but the threat lingered, unseen yet palpable. And Matteo, for the first time in decades, felt the weight of vulnerability settle in his chest. A new chapter had begun, not of power or control, but of fear, love, and uncharted responsibility. And in that quiet, fogged night, Matteo understood that following Isabella had led him not just to danger, but to a reckoning that would change him forever. By the time dawn crept across the city, Matteo had packed lightly, summoning only what he needed to move quickly. The mansion, usually a symbol of his dominion and absolute control, felt alien now, empty and fragile without Isabella and the child safe inside. He kept replaying the photograph in his mind, the subtle menace behind it, and a rare, bitter anger coiled in his chest. Someone had been watching them, someone had marked them, and Matteo knew with brutal certainty he could not allow harm to come to them, not now, not ever. Isabella waited at the gate, her eyes sharp but weary. The night had been long, the threat real, but the exhaustion on her face only made Matteo's heart clench further. He handed her a bundle of supplies silently. She accepted without a word, but the small tension in her shoulders betrayed her fear. The boy clung to her side, looking at Matteo with a tentative trust that filled him with a strange, tender protectiveness. "We move fast," Matteo said finally, his voice low, leaving no room for argument. "No mistakes." Isabella met his gaze, and for a moment, the wall she had built around herself faltered. He could see it, the flicker of relief, the tiny acknowledgement that she could, perhaps, rely on him. But the danger looming over them reminded her, as it reminded him, that trust was fragile and fleeting. They left the mansion, slipping into the quiet streets under the cover of early morning fog. Matteo's eyes scanned constantly, trained to notice the slightest irregularity, the tiniest movement. Every shadow could conceal a threat. Every passerby could be an enemy in disguise. But he did not falter, not when the child's hand brushed against his sleeve, or when Isabella's presence reminded him that he had something to fight for beyond power. Hours later, they found temporary refuge in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Matteo had secured it through contacts who owed him favors. But as he closed the heavy doors behind them, he realized the walls offered no true protection, only a momentary pause in a chase that had already begun. Isabella knelt to check on the boy, brushing crumbs from his clothes and softly murmuring reassurances. Matteo watched them, every instinct screaming that he had never encountered anything so worth protecting. "I need to know everything," Matteo said suddenly, breaking the tense silence. "Who could have taken that photo? Who is watching you?" Isabella's eyes darkened. She shifted the boy in her arms, her voice calm but edged with exhaustion. "It could be anyone," she said. "People from my past, debts I never fully escaped. I thought being careful would be enough. But they found me anyway." Matteo clenched his jaw. "You didn't come to me for help before." She looked up, her stormy gaze meeting his. "Because I didn't trust anyone, especially someone like you." The words stung, but he did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied her, the curve of her jaw, the tension in her shoulders, the way she protected the child without a single word. He realized that she had been surviving alone for years, navigating a dangerous world with nothing but her wits. And here he was, accustomed to commanding empires, suddenly powerless in the face of her courage. "We don't have time for this," he said finally, voice low. "They're coming. Soon. I can't let them touch you. Not him, not you." Her lips pressed into a thin line, a mixture of frustration and relief. "Then we fight," she said simply. "But I'm not helpless. You don't get to protect me alone." Matteo's chest tightened at her words. He had never been challenged like this, not in business, not in the streets, not in his entire life. Her insistence on strength, her refusal to be a damsel, ignited something dangerous and compelling inside him. He wanted to protect her, yes, but he also wanted her to see him as something more than a shadowed figure of fear. Hours passed in tense preparation. Matteo laid out a plan, quietly instructing Isabella on safe zones, signaling methods, and contingencies. She listened carefully, absorbing every word, while the boy clung to her, oblivious to the growing threat. And all the while, Matteo's mind lingered on the impossibility of the situation. The small child, innocent and trusting, held a power over him that rivals never had. His empire, his life, everything he had controlled for decades felt meaningless compared to the weight of this fragile little family in front of him. As night fell, the first signs of pursuit appeared. Shadows moved beyond the warehouse walls, too coordinated to be random, too patient to be accidental. Matteo checked every corner, every exit, his senses razor sharp. Isabella positioned herself defensively. The boy held close to her chest. Neither flinched, neither panicked, though Matteo could see the tension in her shoulders, the tight line of her jaw. "You need to trust me," Matteo said quietly, kneeling beside her. "I won't let them touch you." "I can't." Her gaze softened fractionally, but her voice remained steady. "I trust you, Matteo, but don't think I'll make this easy." He allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I wouldn't have it any other way." The shadows closed in as the night deepened, and Matteo, for the first time in decades, felt a mixture of fear, love, and adrenaline he couldn't name, all twisting together. He was no longer just a mafia boss. He was a protector, a guardian, a man confronting the fragile, powerful force of human connection for the first time in his life. And when the first movement of the attackers became visible, Matteo's instincts sharpened, his body coiling with lethal precision. But beneath the cold efficiency, a fierce warmth burned in his chest, a promise, unspoken but undeniable, that he would protect them, no matter the cost. For the first time, he realized that some battles weren't just about power or fear. They were about love, survival, and the fragile, unshakable bonds that made a man human. And as the night closed around the warehouse, the storm outside felt distant, insignificant. The real storm was inside, and Matteo knew it was only just beginning. The night hung heavy over the warehouse, shadows stretching like fingers across the cracked concrete floor. Matteo crouched near the entrance, eyes scanning every dark corner, senses taut and alive. Isabella knelt beside the boy, brushing damp strands of hair from his face, whispering small reassurances that belied the tension in her body. Neither of them spoke, but every movement, every breath, was a testament to survival instincts honed over years of hardship. Matteo felt an unfamiliar respect and a strange, unsettling admiration for her unyielding resolve. Then the first sound came, a faint scrape of metal against stone, almost imperceptible, but enough to set Matteo's pulse hammering. Shadows shifted outside the warehouse walls, coalescing into shapes, figures that moved with precision. He didn't hesitate. His hand went to the pistol at his hip, and his other hand rested on the blade strapped to his boot. The calm, calculated fury of a man used to command surged through him. "They're here," he whispered. Isabella's eyes met his, sharp and unflinching. "I see them," she said softly, voice steady but tense. "But we can't run. We can fight if we need to." Matteo's gaze softened for a fraction of a second as he looked at her. She wasn't just the woman who had stolen bread and captured his attention. She was a fighter, a protector, and now, a partner in a battle she didn't choose but could not avoid. And the boy clung to her, eyes wide with fear, unaware of the danger but sensing the gravity in Matteo's presence. The first of the attackers breached the outer perimeter, moving quickly, silently, but not silently enough. Matteo's trained eyes followed their every step. He saw the flash of a gun, the slight movement of a hand reaching for a weapon, and he struck swift, precise, a shadow among shadows. The first man went down before he even knew what had hit him. Isabella flinched at the sudden violence, but did not retreat. She moved instinctively, positioning herself between the boy and the attackers, her arms ready to shield him. Matteo glanced at her, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. Survival required cooperation, trust, and courage. She nodded subtly, and together, They became an unspoken unit, two protectors against a tide of danger. The warehouse erupted into a chaotic dance of movement and shadow. Matteo moved with lethal efficiency, every strike calculated, every shot precise. But he noticed the smallest details, the way Isabella's hands shook slightly as she protected the child, the quick, silent command she issued to keep him safe. Her strength was not brute force, it was intelligence, courage, and an unbreakable will to survive. And it struck Matteo harder than any blow could. The boy's small whimper drew his attention, and Matteo's chest tightened. He moved to shield him, his body instinctively placing itself between the child and the nearest threat. Isabella followed, eyes wide but unflinching, and in that moment the three of them became a single, fragile unit bound by fear, trust, and something deeper, something unspoken. The attackers were skilled, but not prepared for this kind of coordinated defense. Matteo's experience, combined with Isabella's instinctive protective maneuvers, created an unpredictable, formidable resistance. Shadows fell, bodies moved, and the air was filled with the tension of imminent danger. And all the while, Matteo's mind raced not with strategy alone, but with a rising awareness that he had never felt such a desperate, personal need to protect someone. One of the attackers lunged at Isabella, a blade glinting in the dim light. She froze for just a fraction of a second, and Matteo's instincts overtook him. He intercepted the man, moving with a speed and precision that left no room for error. The attacker crumpled silently to the floor, and Matteo's chest heaved, adrenaline and something else, fear perhaps, but also relief coursing through him. Isabella looked at him then, truly looked, and Matteo saw something in her eyes that made his pulse quicken, respect, gratitude, and a hint of something warmer, something dangerous. The boy, still clinging to her, looked at Matteo with wide, trusting eyes, and in that instant, Matteo realized that he had never truly fought for anyone, for anything like this before. The fight ended as abruptly as it began. The attackers, realizing the situation had turned against them, retreated into the shadows, leaving the warehouse silent but for the ragged breaths of those who survived. Matteo stood, scanning the darkened corners, ensuring no threat remained. Isabella moved to the boy, holding him close, whispering soft reassurances. Matteo watched them, chest tightening. The danger had passed, for now, but the adrenaline and tension lingered. And as he looked at Isabella, at the fierce protectiveness etched into her features, at the small hand of the child clutching hers, he felt an unfamiliar, powerful emotion rising in his chest. Pride, perhaps, fear, love, though he would not admit it even to himself. "I thought I could protect you alone," he said quietly, voice low, almost a murmur. "But I was wrong." Isabella's eyes softened, and for the first time, a small, fleeting smile touched her lips. "You don't have to do it alone," she said. "We can do this together." The boy giggled softly, unaware of the violence that had just unfolded, sensing only the safety in their combined presence. Matteo's chest tightened again. He realized that this protecting them, fighting for them, surviving with them was no longer about power, revenge, or empire. It was about them. And in that silent, fragile moment, Matteo Vercelli understood a truth he had spent his entire life avoiding. Some things, some people were worth more than any empire. The warehouse, scarred by the encounter, stood as a testament to the night's chaos. Outside, the city slept, unaware of the storm that had just passed, unaware of the fragile new bond forged in the shadows. Matteo, Isabella, and the boy were bound together now by more than survival. They were bound by trust, by courage, and by the first, dangerous stirrings of something neither of them could name fully, but both could feel. And as they huddled together, the quiet after the storm felt more profound, more intimate than anything Matteo had ever known. He knew that the next danger would come, that the world outside would not wait, that their lives would never be simple. But for the first time, he did not feel alone, because for the first time in decades, he had someone to fight for. The first light of dawn filtered through the dusty windows of the warehouse, falling across Matteo's face in slanted beams. He sat against a crate, hands clasped, mind racing. The night's fight had left him physically unscathed, but emotionally shattered. He had confronted danger before, enemies who wanted his life, rivals who would stop at nothing, but none of that had ever carried the weight of responsibility he now felt for Isabella and her child. This was different. Personal. Raw. Real. Isabella sat a few feet away. The boy nestled in her lap, brushing his hair with a tenderness Matteo couldn't fathom. He watched her, noting the careful, deliberate movements, the way she whispered encouragement and reassurance, the patience that had allowed them all to survive, not just the night, but years of hardship. He realized then that he had never seen strength like this, not in business, not in power, not in himself. And then the thought hit him like a cold blade. He had missed 3 years. 3 years of her life. 3 years of the boy's life. And he had been blind. He had been wrapped in his empire, his rules, his control, thinking that fear was power, that distance was safety. And yet here they were alive, defiant, and yet vulnerable to a world that would not forgive weakness. "Matteo," Isabella said softly, her voice pulling him from the spiral of his thoughts. He turned to see her eyes fixed on him, a quiet question in her gaze. "You've been quiet all morning. What's wrong?" He exhaled slowly, trying to gather the words that refused to form. I keep thinking about the past," he admitted finally, "about the mistakes I've made, about the people I've hurt, about not being here when it mattered." Her gaze softened slightly, and she shifted the boy so he could see Matteo better. The small hand of the child reached for him, tentative but trusting, and Matteo felt a pang of guilt so sharp it took his breath away. He had always controlled everything, ruled everything, yet he had failed in the simplest, most human way, being present where he was needed most. "You can't change the past," Isabella said, voice firm but gentle. "All we can do is survive now, together." The words struck him deeply. He had spent decades trying to control every outcome, believing he could bend the world to his will. And now, faced with the fragile reality of survival and trust, he realized the harshest lesson of all: some things could not be controlled, some hearts could not be commanded, and some mistakes could not be undone. He looked at her, truly looked, and noticed the subtle signs of struggle etched into her face, the faint lines of worry around her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the way she flinched at sounds that Matteo had barely registered. She had lived this life alone, navigating danger with nothing but her courage and cunning, and he had taken that for granted. "I want to make it right," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I can't undo what I've missed, but I want to protect you. Both of you. I want to be here if you'll let me." Isabella studied him, her stormy gray eyes searching, weighing, measuring. She saw the truth in his words, saw the raw honesty that he rarely, if ever, allowed himself to display, and slowly, cautiously, she nodded. "Then prove it," she said simply, "not with words, with actions, every day. Otherwise, it won't matter." Matteo felt the weight of her challenge settle over him, heavy and unforgiving, and for the first time he welcomed it. Because proving himself meant more than power, more than wealth, more than fear. It meant becoming someone capable of love, trust, and protection, qualities he had long buried beneath his empire. Hours later, as they moved through the abandoned streets toward a safer location, Isabella finally began to speak about her past, not all at once, but in fragments, careful, deliberate, and painful. She told him about the depths she had run from, the men who had sought her life, the family she had lost, the struggles she had endured to keep the boy alive. Every word was a dagger of reality, every confession a revelation of the courage that had shaped her into the woman standing beside him. Matteo listened in silence, absorbing each detail. He felt a growing respect, but also an ache that bordered on guilt. He had ruled an empire with fear and calculation, yet here was a woman who had survived, alone, without leverage, without influence, relying only on her strength and cunning. And he, powerful, feared, untouchable, had only just noticed her. By nightfall, they reached a secluded safe house, a modest apartment with enough space for them to regroup. Matteo arranged the small living space with precision, ensuring exits, reinforcing windows, and creating a sense of security he had never applied to anything outside of his criminal dealings. Isabella moved through the space cautiously, evaluating every detail, while the boy explored, with childlike curiosity, oblivious to the weight of danger that hung in the air. As the night deepened, Matteo found himself sitting across from Isabella at the small wooden table. The air was thick with unspoken thoughts, the tension of survival mingling with the fragile beginnings of trust. He realized that every action he had taken, every choice he had made, had led him to this moment not just to protect, but to connect. "I wanted to know everything," he said finally, voice low, serious. "The full truth. No omissions. I can't protect you if I don't understand what we're facing." Isabella's gaze met his, steady, unwavering. "Then you'll learn," she said quietly. "And you'll see why we fight every day to survive. Not for power, not for revenge, but for life itself." Matteo nodded slowly, a sense of solemn determination settling over him. He understood that the battles ahead would not just be external, but internal. He would have to confront his past, his mistakes, and the walls he had built around his heart. But for the first time he felt capable of it. Because he was no longer alone. The child crawled into his lap, small arms wrapping around his neck, and Matteo held him tightly. He looked at Isabella and saw not just the woman who had stolen bread, but the mother, survivor, the fighter, and perhaps, one day, the love he had never allowed himself to feel. And as the night stretched on, Matteo realized the truth. Some mistakes could not be undone, but some bonds, once forged, could reshape a life entirely new. The following days passed in tense vigilance. Matteo rarely slept, walking the perimeter of the safe house in silence, listening to every creak of the building, every distant sound from the streets. The city outside seemed ordinary, but he knew better. Danger could strike at any moment, and the photograph from before haunted him, a constant reminder that their enemies were patient, cunning, and relentless. Isabella and the boy moved cautiously through their new temporary home. Every noise made her flinch, every shadow drew a tightening in her chest. Matteo watched her, noting every subtle movement, the way her hands lingered protectively on the boy's shoulder, careful glances toward doors and windows, the way she measured the distance between them and potential danger. She was extraordinary, and he had no right to be fascinated, no right to care so much, yet he could not stop himself. One evening, as Matteo reviewed the perimeter and the traps he had set, Isabella approached him cautiously. The boy slept quietly on a makeshift bed, unaware of the threat that lingered outside their walls. "Matteo," she said softly, "we need to talk. About your past. About what you do, about who you are, because one day it will catch up to you, and it could destroy all of us." He didn't turn immediately, his hands busy adjusting the locks on the windows. He could feel the weight of her gaze, patient but insistent. Finally, he faced her, the shadows of the room accentuating the hard lines of his face. "You think I don't know," he said quietly. "You think I've never considered what could happen. I've lived my entire life in the knowledge that my enemies are always close, and that I am always the target." Isabella's eyes softened, though her intensity never wavered. "Then you know this won't end with just us hiding. One day, someone will come for him, for me, for you. And when that day comes, we need to be ready not just to survive, but to fight together." He nodded slowly, feeling the gravity of her words. She wasn't just speaking of the present danger, she was speaking of a life that was always balanced on the edge of violence, a world he had built and ruled, a world that now intertwined with hers in ways he had never expected. The following night, the inevitable happened. Shadows crept across the perimeter of the safe house, silent and patient. But Matteo had anticipated them. The attackers were precise, skilled, but he was sharper. He moved like a phantom through the darkness, every step calculated, every strike measured. Isabella followed his lead, instinctively shielding the boy, her movements seamless and lethal in their own way. And then, in the midst of the chaos, Matteo saw one figure step forward, a man from his past, someone who knew the Empire, someone who knew him personally. Recognition flashed, anger flared, and he realized the danger was not just external. It was intimately tied to the life he had built, the choices he had made, and the empire he had controlled with ruthless efficiency. The confrontation was brutal but swift. Matteo's years of experience gave him an edge, but the presence of Isabella and the boy added a vulnerability he could not ignore. Every decision, every strike, Every movement was weighed against their safety. He had never fought like this before, not for himself, not for power, not for fear. He fought for them. When the fight ended, the enemies retreating into the shadows, Matteo looked at Isabella, at the boy, and realized the magnitude of what they had survived. They had faced danger together. And in that shared experience, something shifted. Trust had deepened, bonds had strengthened, and an unspoken connection had solidified between them. But the victory was fleeting. Matteo knew this was only the beginning. Their enemies were patient, and now they were aware that he was personally involved. The stakes had risen, and the danger would come again, more calculated, more relentless. Isabella studied him quietly, noting the tension in his posture, the exhaustion in his movements, and the fire in his eyes. "We can survive this," she said finally. "But we can't do it alone. We need to trust each other completely." He nodded, feeling the weight of her words. Trust, a concept he had long discarded, was now essential, not just for survival, but for the fragile human connection that had begun to take root in his heart. That night, as they huddled together, the boy asleep between them, Matteo allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He had spent decades in control, in power, in fear, but none of that had prepared him for this, for the need to protect someone out of love, not obligation, for the realization that the empire, the wealth, the fear, it all meant nothing compared to the fragile, beating hearts he now held responsibility for. And as dawn approached, painting the world in soft, muted colors, Matteo understood something he had never admitted to himself. He had already lost control of his heart. Isabella and her child had claimed it, quietly, irrevocably, and there was no returning to the life he had known before. But he also knew this. The coming days would test them, push them to the limits of survival and endurance. And through it all, he would fight not for power, not for fear, but for love, for family, for redemption. Because for the first time, Matteo Vercelli understood what it meant to live not just as a mafia boss, but as a man who could care, who could protect, who could be human. And the storm outside, distant yet unyielding, seemed to echo the turmoil inside him, the chaos, the danger, the uncertainty. And yet, for the first time, he did not feel alone. The night air was thick and cold as Matteo led Isabella and the boy through the narrow alleys of the city's outskirts. Every shadow seemed alive, every distant sound a potential threat. Matteo's senses were taut, every nerve alert, but his mind also churned with something far more dangerous than vigilance: regret. He had spent years building an empire of fear, of control, of untouchable power, and yet here he was, powerless in the ways that truly mattered, against time lost, against love unclaimed, against the mistakes that had cost him 3 years of the child's life. "Where are we going?" Isabella asked quietly, her tone calm but sharp. The boy slept slumped against her shoulder, small breaths, shallow and steady, a fragile anchor for Matteo's spiraling thoughts. "To a place they won't find us," Matteo replied, voice low, deliberate. "For now. But we can't stay still. Not for long." Isabella studied him silently, sensing the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. She had long learned to read people, to measure intent and hidden truths, and she could see it in him. Now, exhaustion, guilt, and a protective fire that no amount of fear or power could extinguish. He wasn't just guarding them, he was changed. And that realization both frightened and reassured her. Hours later, they arrived at a small, inconspicuous apartment on the edge of the city. Matteo secured the perimeter, checked the locks, and even positioned improvised alarms using materials scavenged from his contacts. Every precaution, every detail was necessary, but he realized it would never be enough. They were hunters and hunted, and in this game mistakes could cost lives. As night fell, Isabella finally spoke, breaking the tense silence that had settled between them. "Matteo," she began, her voice steady, but weighted with unspoken fear. "There's something you need to know about why they're after me." Matteo froze, the words cutting through the exhaustion and adrenaline like a sharp blade. "Go on," he said cautiously. She took a deep breath. "It's about my family and about him." She gestured toward the boy, who stirred slightly, sensing the tension. "They were involved in something dangerous. When I escaped, I thought I could disappear. But they never forgot. And now they found us." Matteo's chest tightened. Every instinct screamed at him to protect, to act, to eliminate the threat. But he also realized something he hadn't allowed himself to admit. The danger wasn't just external. It was personal. The mistakes of his past, the life he had led, had brought them here, and now he carried the responsibility not just for survival, but for redemption. They'll come, Isabella continued. Soon. And when they do, I can't guarantee anything. Matteo took a deep breath, kneeling beside the boy, placing a protective hand on his small shoulder. The child looked up at him, trusting, innocent, unaware of the storm circling them. Matteo felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. He had spent a lifetime commanding fear, exacting control, and yet here, with this small family, he felt powerless, and it was terrifying. They won't harm you, he said quietly, almost a vow to himself, not while I'm here. I won't let anyone touch you. I can't. I won't. Isabella's gaze softened, but a shadow of doubt lingered. It won't just be them, she warned. It's everything from our pasts. They're connected, Matteo. Your enemies, my enemies, it all collides now. And you have to understand, some things can't be fixed with force. Matteo's jaw tightened. He had spent decades relying on force to control outcomes, to eliminate threats, to bend reality to his will. But here, facing the fragility of human life and trust, he realized force alone was not enough. Protection required strategy, patience, understanding, and perhaps something he had long denied himself: love. The night deepened, and the first signs of pursuit appeared, distant lights flickering, shadows shifting beyond the windows. Matteo positioned himself strategically, Isabella ready at his side, the boy between them. They waited silent, tense, hearts beating in rhythm with the city's pulse. And then they struck. The first attack was swift, precise, and brutal. Matteo moved like a shadow, every strike calculated, every movement instinctive. Isabella followed, shielding the boy, reacting with the reflexes of a mother who had survived horrors to protect her child. The attackers were skilled, coordinated, but unprepared for the bond between them. Matteo's lethal experience combined with Isabella's protective cunning and the child's presence, creating an unpredictable, unbreakable defense. Amid the chaos, Matteo caught sight of the leader, a man with a face he recognized from the darker corners of his past, a figure whose history with him was personal, vengeful. Rage flared, but Matteo pushed it aside, focusing on protecting the family before him. Every decision was for them, every action measured against the fragile lives he now carried on his conscience. When the fight ended, the attackers retreating into the darkness, silence returned, but the weight of survival pressed down on them all. Matteo stood, scanning for threats, every muscle tense. Isabella pulled the boy close, her small frame trembling slightly but resolute. Matteo exhaled, the realization settling like a stone in his chest. This was not just survival. This was love, trust, and redemption intertwined with danger. The battles ahead would test them all, but he could not turn away. And as they huddled together in the quiet aftermath, Matteo knew, with unwavering certainty, that no empire, no power, no fear could ever replace the bond he now felt. For the first time, he understood what truly mattered: them. His family, his heart. The first light of dawn crept over the city, painting the streets in pale gold, softening the chaos of the night. Matteo, Isabella, and the boy sat in the safe house, the quiet almost unbearable after the tension that had consumed them for days. Matteo's body ached from exhaustion, his mind still sharp with vigilance, but his chest carried something heavier weight. That was no longer fear, but relief, guilt, and an unfamiliar tenderness that made him ache in ways power never had. They were alive. For now. The enemies who had pursued them had retreated into the shadows, their threat diminished but not erased. Matteo knew the danger wasn't truly gone, it never would be. But he also knew that they had survived, together. And that realization carried a strength deeper than any weapon in his arsenal. Isabella tended to the boy, brushing crumbs from his clothes, whispering soft reassurances as he clung to her side. Matteo watched them, studying the small family that had come to mean everything. He realized he had spent decades commanding fear, controlling empires, and suppressing emotion. Yet here with them, He felt powerless in a way that was exhilarating and terrifying. He had discovered something he had long denied. The human heart, fragile, yet unyielding, demanded honesty, courage, and vulnerability. "Matteo," Isabella said softly, breaking the silence, "we need to talk about the future. About what comes next, because hiding forever isn't a life. Not for him, not for us." He nodded, swallowing hard. He had been thinking the same thing, haunted by the knowledge that his enemy would return, that his past choices could not simply be undone. "We can't stay hidden," he admitted, "but we can survive, together. I'll make sure of it. No one will harm you or him while I live." Her eyes softened slightly, but the strength in her gaze never wavered. "Then prove it," she said, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Every day. Not with words, but with everything you have." Matteo's chest tightened. He had spent his life commanding fear, yet here he realized that trust and love were far more powerful and far more fragile. "I will," he said quietly. "Every day. I promise." For the first time in years, the boy climbed onto Matteo's lap voluntarily, small arms wrapping around his neck. The child's trust was absolute, innocent, and it cut through the layers of guilt and regret Matteo had carried for decades. He held him tightly, vowing silently to never fail him, never abandon him, never let harm touch him. The weight of that promise was heavier than any empire he had ever ruled, and yet it felt right. Isabella joined them, kneeling beside Matteo, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The connection between them was unspoken, undeniable, and charged with the intensity of shared struggle, danger, and emerging love. Matteo looked into her eyes, seeing the woman who had survived unimaginable odds, the mother who had protected her child with courage that rivaled his own, and the partner who now shared the burden of survival and the promise of something more. "Matteo," she whispered, her voice steady but intimate, "we've survived this far. We can survive anything if we do it together." He nodded, the tightness in his chest easing just slightly. "Together," he echoed, "always." The city outside slowly awoke, unaware of the storm that had passed in. The quiet warehouse, unaware of the lives that had hung in the balance. Matteo knew the danger would return, it always did, but the fear that had once defined him had been replaced by something stronger, something human, love, loyalty, and the fierce desire to protect the fragile life he now held as precious as his own. In the days that followed, Matteo and Isabella moved carefully, rebuilding a semblance of normalcy while remaining vigilant. The boy laughed more freely, his innocence a balm to the scars Matteo had carried. They ate together, spoke together, and navigated the world with a fragile but growing sense of unity. Matteo found himself softening in ways he had never imagined, learning patience, trust, and the quiet art of care. And in the quiet moments, when the boy slept and the city breathed softly outside, Matteo allowed himself to feel the depth of his transformation. He had once been a man ruled by fear, control, and ruthless ambition. Now, he was a man capable of love, protection, and redemption, a man who had been given the rarest of chances, a family he had chosen, and who had chosen him in return. Finally, one evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and painted the room in a warm glow, Matteo took Isabella's hand gently in his. She didn't pull away. Instead, she allowed the connection, the quiet intimacy of survival and trust, to settle between them. The boy clung to her side, smiling softly at the rare moment of calm. "I don't know what the future holds," Matteo said quietly, voice thick with emotion. "But I know this. I won't let anything take you from me. Not now, not ever." Isabella's eyes glistened, and she squeezed his hand, finally allowing herself to trust fully, to hope. "And I won't let anything take you either," she whispered. "We'll face it together." The city outside continued, oblivious to the lives that had been forever changed within these walls. Matteo leaned back, holding them both close, feeling for the first time a peace he had never known, a love he had never allowed himself to feel, and a redemption he had thought impossible. And in that quiet, golden light, he understood he had lost nothing that truly mattered, and gained everything he never expected. Because in the end, survival was not enough. Family, trust, love, these were the things worth fighting for. And Matteo Vercelli would fight for them, every single day, for the rest of his life. If you followed their journey this far, don't forget to like the video, and subscribe to the channel to witness more cinematic stories filled with love, suspense, and heart-stopping twists.